So, Zach, as Phoebe mentioned in her introduction, you are prolific as an artist, but also you do a lot of education work and also commercial work. And I know it's really important to you to keep a balance between these three things. So I thought we'd start by asking how you got involved basically in these three fields and why it's so important to you to keep.
Yeah, I always describe those three fields, which is artwork, commercial work, and teaching, as three legs of a stool. And that for me, it's been really important to create a balanced career and to have these different sort of aspects of how I spend my time. In terms of how I got started with them, in terms of teaching, I always really loved teaching. Like once I got to Parsons, so I was studying fine art, I had to get a job. Everybody was talking about web design and Y2K and the world's going to end in the year 2000. And I fell in love with this medium. I discovered Flash, basically, and I fell in love with this medium. And then I went to graduate school. And at graduate school, I was like finding all these weird things. I found this thing called design by numbers, which was a tool that was developed at MIT. It's a precursor to processing. And I remember the first workshop that I ever taught was a workshop in design by numbers. And I just loved like being in a classroom and sharing the things that I was curious about or excited about and seeing that the energy reflected back in the works that students were making. And then in terms of artwork and commercial work, it's been, ever since graduate school, kind of working in those fields. But for me, the most important thing is how these things relate to each other. So I try to take the things that I learned doing commercial work and I bring it into the classroom and I show the students, how do you, like, artwork is work. Like, what is the work involved? And then I take I feel almost, from the classroom, I feel like a vampire, and I try to take the energy that the students have. Like, they're so excited about this medium that feels really new. It is new to them. So I try to take that energy and use that in how I approach the work, and bring that to my art practice. And I take the ideas that I learn in my art practice and bring it to my commercial practice. And for me, these things always should be in conversation with each other.
Yeah, and so you studied fine art. So does that mean you taught yourself all the code and everything self-taught?
Yeah, at the beginning, so I studied fine art, painting and printmaking. I spent all of my time in the printmaking studio. I loved it. I was so happy. But again, I had to get a job. And I got a job at a web design company that had the name Corporate Voice, which you could imagine. And it was like amazing. Like, I learned Photoshop, I learned Illustrator, I learned all these tools. And then they were like, we want you to learn Flash. And I was like, what is this? And I went to Barnes & Noble and I bought a book. And then I started to discover all this work that people were making. So it was not just the tool, but it was actually, at that time, artists like Yugo Nakamura, Amit Pataru, Joshua Davis. It was like, that was very cool, like seeing all of this ways that people were creating, but they were also sharing online, and kind of reminded me of the energy of the printmaking studio. So I spent a lot of time like hanging out on message boards and trying code and remixing code and so on. And then I went to graduate school, and that's where I met Golden Nica, who was my teacher. He came from Media Lab, and I started to learn it and take it more seriously once I went to graduate school.
Maybe this is an impossible question, but what do you think it is about code that so entrances you as an artist?
For me, it was, with Flash in particular, it was this amazing thing of just such a simple sentence, like x equals x plus 1, right? And then the object starts to move, the x position of the object. And then it goes off the screen. And so you say, if x is greater than width of the screen, x equals 0. And those are basic, right? You start with something really simple. But then you start to say, like, how could I make this thing move in an organic way? How could I make it shake? How could I make it move away from the mouse? How can I make it attracted to the mouse? You start to think about forces and physics and math. And to me, it's about, I think there's such a beauty in the relationship of language and words and text to images. Like, everything in this room came from a for loop, came from a sine wave, came from, from words. And to me, there's something I find really beautiful. And then the other thing is that it's like a great medium if you really like to mess with stuff, if you're like a noodler, because you'd be in there and you'd be like 0.01, 0.02, 0.03, and as you adjust numbers, I feel like most people think of coding, you just think you're typing all the time. But I think most of the art is actually in tweaking and tweaking and seeing the relationships between these different mathematical ideas.
And you've called it poetry with code, which I think makes more sense now when you talk about the textual element. But this actually segues nicely into the exhibition, which has a great title, I think, Circles, Blobs, Riffles. And I wondered if you could explain a little bit about what that's a reference to.
We were thinking a lot about the exhibit and trying to design an exhibit that would focus on the breadth of the sketching that I do and finding topics in terms of the sketching that I was really in love with. And at the same time, an artist that I really admire, Vera Molnar, had just passed away. So we're thinking about her work and her legacy. She was born in 1924, and so she was 99 years old, and her work means a lot to me. And she has this quote, and I don't have it in front of me, so I apologize if I say it wrong, but she said, my life is triangles, squares, lines. And I just love this idea, like the idea you could say, like, my life is triangles, squares, lines, that you could dedicate yourself to something, that you could actually kind of just work and work and work with a certain geometry and keep discovering something from it. When I think about my own practice, I have dedicated myself to these forms. Like the blob is a form that I come to again and again in my sketching. Every 6 months, every year, I will make blobs, and I see them with new eyes. I see them, I'm changing and the blobs are changing, and I'm in a conversation with it. So in a way, the title is a kind of homage to her work because it means so much to me. And one of the nice details of the show as we were figuring out how to set it up, and I want to take a moment just to thank Alice and Phoebe and the folks from UNIT who have been awesome to work with. But on one of the calls, I remember Alice had done research into how Vera Molnar exhibits her work and the ways that she sets it up. And so some of the placements, so for example, the placement behind us is an homage to how she would show variations, not just showing variations side by side, but actually kind of composing them on the wall. And so the show is a kind of tribute. And this is an artist that I really love. And I teach a class at MIT where we recreate artworks from the past, and every week I come in and I talk about a different artist or designer who I admire, and the students recreate their work. And the first week we teach about Vera Molnar, and it was a very cool week for me because I went to Boston, I taught my first class, I gave a lecture about Vera Molnar. I had to change the slides, which said, born in 1924. I had to edit the slide, which was a sad moment, but it was like a joyful moment to see the students researching her and thinking about what are they going to recreate and asking questions about her work. And then I went from the classroom to here, like I jumped on an airplane and came here, and it was like, I feel like it's like a week where I get to celebrate her work.
So in terms of these shapes, the circles, the blobs, and the ripples, one thing I think is really interesting is that often we think of generative art, work made with code, as being very linear. Yeah. This is so organic. I'm just curious about what it is about these forms that you think maybe speaks to you so much.
I see these forms as related in that if you take a circle and you kind of bend it, you can think of it as a blob. If you take a circle and you repeat it, you have a ripple. So those are all variations on a circle. And the circle is, I think, just a really interesting form in terms of how you code it, right? What is the algorithm or the code or the language behind a circle? And if you sort of study those algorithms, you can start with the circle, and then you can manipulate it, and it becomes a spiral. Or, even these, for example, they start with a very basic premise, which is, the color of a pixel is based on the distance from the center. And if it's greater than a certain amount, it's one color. If it's less, then it's another color. And that's one way to draw a circle, right? Asking a question about distance. But once you ask that question, you can poke at that question and say, what if it wasn't a hard edge? What if it was a soft edge? What if it was blurring and moving and morphing and off axis? You can start to ask interesting questions and see the sorts of forms that emerge. And to me, the circle is a kind of, I don't know, it feels like a starting point for a conversation about distance and about geometry and about all kinds of forms.
Makes sense. And with these works in particular, I can't remember, the name of the artist, but there was a painter that I read in
Oh, yeah.
Sophie's essay, there's a really interesting relationship with some painterly abstraction as well,
Yeah.
which is obviously made in a very different way, but it has a similar...
Yeah, there's a Polish artist named Wojciech Fengor who has these really beautiful circular paintings. And what I love about them is that they're so simple. They're just colors, like bands of color that are blurring from one color to another. And it's kind of, he's using the circle, but it's soft. And so it's you kind of grasping for an edge, you're grasping for something. And they are, I find it's very helpful to have almost like North Star artists, like an artist that I really look up to, and I just have, you know, a scrapbook of all their work, like Vera Molnar or like Wojciech Fengor, where I just, when I'm anxious, I will just look at it and just meditate on it and think, like, how can I make, like, how does this work make me feel, and how can I make work that makes me feel the same way?
And you've alluded to this earlier, but I wondered if we could talk a bit about the process of making these works.
Yeah.
What that's rooted in, what that looks like.
Yeah. So everything you see here is coded. Some of the work is moving, some of it's not moving. There's a lot of still printed work here. And they're all coming from work in different languages. So either I'm working in openFrameworks, which is C++, or P5.js, which is JavaScript. A lot of the work is shader-based programming, which is a kind of a very different way of programming, because you're writing the logic for the pixel, not thinking about the overall image, but actually writing like a tiny bit of code that's executed at the pixel level. And oftentimes when I'm sketching, I start with motion. To me, motion is really crucial. So I'm constantly building things that are kind of moving and animating and dancing. And then when I make still images, I'm almost trying to capture them. And I mentioned this to you before, but like, I feel like a wildlife photographer, just like click, 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 click. And then I might have 1,000 images and pick 10 that I really love. And actually for this exhibition, like I murdered my hard drive. Like there's only 22 images in here, but like my hard drive is like completely murdered. Like I'm gonna go back to New York and archive everything. You know, I would create 1,000 images and then I would select 100 and then talk to the folks with Unit and we'd jump on a call, and it was like picking members of a basketball team. And we're like, oh, what if we did this? Oh no, let's swap out this one with this one. And it was challenging and really fun to figure out how to select and how to curate and make a show. And of course, we could have a wall with like 100 of these, but actually, can you tell a story with 8? Can you tell a story with 6? Can you still tell a story with 1? And that was a just like really fun challenge.
Which is another thing that we talked about earlier was you have done some long-form generative projects, but it seems that the kind of selection of the outputs is really crucial to your work.
Yeah.
It's not just setting up the thing and then letting other people.
Yeah, I mean, I have done long-form stuff, and I find it's a super interesting way of making work, but actually, I really like curating. Like I mean, what was really enjoyable about this process is sending a bunch to Unit and hearing what they like and kind of having a conversation about images. And I think there's obviously a place for it. I think there's a lot of long-form projects that make a lot of sense and are really beautiful. It's a beautiful way to explore an algorithm. But there are a lot of projects where I think like, oh, I'd actually just like to see 5 of these. You know, like I'm not sure that there needs to be 500, you know? But actually I would love to see like, what are your top 5? Like what are the most surprising, weird, interesting outputs? And, you know, to me, some long form work I think could be short form.
Mm. So those are the things, you're looking for just some kind of thing that grabs you. There's no specific.
So what I'm looking for is, I'm going to describe it. If you ever have a music album or a song that you listen to that makes you feel like really different, you know, so for example, for me, it might be like a Cocteau Twins album, or there's a trumpeter, I'm going to forget this name, John Hassel, who does this like just insane, like really beautiful music where there's like one song that if I listen to, like makes me feel a certain way. And I try to find images or videos or movement that make me feel like how those albums make me feel, which is just different. And then I think if I feel that way, then maybe other people will feel something.
And there's also another thing I wanted to talk about is this daily sketching thing that you put out, because I know that's also sort of where this show came from a little bit.
Yeah, so everything you see here comes from a practice of making daily sketches, which started in 2016, so I've been doing it for 8 years. And the daily sketching actually is an interesting story, which was, I had not been so active on social media. I had a Twitter account, and, I had, of course, I would jump on Twitter and complain about JavaScript or something. And, but I was not working in such an open way. Like, I was working in open source, but I would do these projects like once a year, once every 6 months. And this crazy thing happened, which was my father passed away. So I was 38 at the time. My father passed away. And I remember I was like in France installing some artwork, and I jumped on a plane to go back to Chicago. And I had to join Facebook. Did not have a Facebook account. I didn't have an Instagram account. I joined Facebook because it was the only way for me to communicate with, distant family members and friends, like folks from my father's generation. And my whole time I was like, oh, F Facebook, F Instagram, like, I don't want to be a part of this. But I remember I joined it, and I was like, okay, fine, I have to. And I joined Instagram, and I didn't think anything about it. And then it was New Year's. It was like half a year later. And I had this tradition of making a New Year's card, like an animated New Year's card.
That's cool.
And I was like, once a year, I'd be like, coding something and saying hello. And I just started on New Year's, January 1st, 2016. And I said, Happy New Year's. And then I really loved it. Like, I was using Instagram. That was my first post. And Instagram had this limit of 15 seconds for video. And I just thought 15 seconds is just a super short amount of time. So what could I express in 15 seconds? What was nice about it is that it gave me a lot of freedom. If you make something, I find with students, like, the longer you work on something, the bigger the payoff would be. And I remember I'd see students like work for a year on a game that they're going to put in the App Store. And like, the longer you work on it, the more the payoff has to be. But if you make something in a day or in 15 minutes or in half an hour or whatever, it doesn't have to pay off. You could just be like, small. And for me, there was something really magical about working in a very small way, just making and sharing, and getting to the point of thinking of like publishing as almost a kind of muscle. And I remember I had this student whose work I really admire. He's a great artist, Evan Roth, and he built this, as part of an art project, he built this plugin for WordPress where when you press publish, you hear the sound of people applauding, which was like, it was just awesome. It was like you press publish and you hear like, wah! And I remember seeing that project because his whole thing was like, just like make and share, make and share, make and share. And when I started to do this process, it was almost like I internalized that sound. And I felt like I just want to strengthen that. And I want to strengthen that idea of like, if I take a screenshot, if I like something enough to capture it for myself, I'll just put it out there without thinking much about what it is. And then actually sharing it is a way it helps me learn about it.
Do you remember what that first one looked like? I mean,
yeah. The first one, so I had been experimenting with light and reflection, and it was like incredibly complicated. I spelled out Happy New Year's, and I had found a font which was created by a single line. It's called the Hershey font. It's like a very cool, it's like if you do like plotting or engraving, it's a font that you know about. That's like a single line. And so I found a way to write the message, Happy New Year. And then I calculated if light was bouncing, what are the kind of mirrors that the light would have to bounce off to make those letters. So it was like very complex. Like, I was like, not a simple New Year's, message. But it was actually very cool because the light sort of like diffuse and then the mirrors rotate into place and you see the message for a second. Yeah.
And every day, are the sketches new, completely new, or are they variations on previous work that you've done?
They're mostly variations. So I'm really lazy, and I just try to do, I believe in the idea of just changing something. So actually, it's a lot of the work I find is just trying to do the smallest possible change to make something new. Mm-hmm. I think it's really intimidating if you start with a blank piece of paper. If you just say, I'm gonna make a song a day, I'm gonna make a drawing a day. It's like actually intimidating to start with a blank piece of paper to know where to start. But for me, it's really, I think this is a great medium because you can take the same underlying code and express a lot of different ideas and say like, and for me, it's oftentimes like taking a form, like a blob, and saying, what happens if I extrude it? What happens if I revolve it? What happens if I cut it, if I mix it? And a lot of the things that I do are almost kind of producing variations on the same form. So it's, in a way, I'm getting to know it better. And I oftentimes will try to like just break things, like get to a point where it's breaking. Sometimes I get to the point where I'm like breaking FFmpeg or whatever algorithms are compressing the video. But I just try to like push it and push it and push it until I get bored. And I do get bored, and then I'll like try something else. And in a way, I think about it like the feeling, like if you ever go to a new city, you have this experience of navigating, and you're kind of playing, you're sort of understanding the known and unknown. So let's say you're spending like a significant amount of time in a city, not like a day or a weekend, but several weeks or a month. You might like just like venture a little bit further from what you're used to. And then you might be like, oh, this neighborhood feels a little weird. I'm going to go back to this park that I really love. And you wind up with like streets and alleys that you really love that you come back to, or neighborhoods or coffee shops or whatever. But then it's like, oh, I'm a little bored. I'm going to try something new. And I think of that in the same way. I'm kind of navigating between known and unknown. And certainly like circles, blobs, and ripples are these very known spaces for me.
And it's interesting because I feel like you're moving between these kind of psychological things that allow you to be creative. And then also there is a conceptual or an artistic logic to it. Like the fact that you're changing things in this way means that they have some connection to each other in a story. It's not just a trick to make things easier.
Yeah, I mean, they're conceptually related, right?
Yeah.
And so you kind of can tell a story with things. And I found it very useful, for example, like with client work, clients will come to me because I put a lot of work out there and I'm sharing a lot. Clients will come to me and say like, oh, we're interested in this. And actually I could say like, oh, like 2 years ago I was doing that. Like here's some other examples. And so it's been very useful to have, it's become like, maybe starting with one sketch leads to a conversation, and it can find a bunch more.
That's interesting because that's how design work works as well, right? Like you present the client with loads of different variations on a specific idea. So there's a parallel there as well between.
Yeah, and I've found for commercial work, the commercial work I do, it tends to be very design oriented, and I've found having a lot of examples has been very helpful. It used to be like a while ago, I would get these briefs, and the briefs were asking me to copy another artist style. So I can't tell you how many briefs I've gotten that were like, oh, can you make this piece like Rafiq Anandal or whatever? And it was like annoying, like so annoying. Like maybe when I was younger, I used to do that, not like copy an artist, but I would be like more of a technician or, creative technologist on a project, which is fine. Like there's a lot of value in that. But now people come to me and they ask me to rip myself off, which is amazing. So then they come to me with a brief, and like the brief has my work in it, and then it's actually like I feel very comfortable ripping myself off. So
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
And then when you mentioned that initial work that you made and how you were looking at how light bounced off, it really, I mean, there is a direct connection to the ripples, especially feels so real as depictions of a natural phenomenon.
Yeah.
Is nature something that is important?
Yeah, of course. So I'm quite interested in light and color. So a lot of the color schemes in some way kind of come from different natural phenomenon, and then light is really important to me because I think it's the sort of building block of media art, that we're constantly working with screens and working with light, and a lot of the work is kind of in relationship with light. And for me, there's something about, I don't know, I just think exploring algorithms of light give me a new way to see geometry, that actually you can kind of, like, it's a way of, it feels really like it makes old things new. And that work in particular was inspired by a trip that I took with my family. We were driving around Canada. We stopped by Maine on the way back to New York, and we rented a boat that we lived on. And so for some days we were living on a boat, and it was fun. Like if we wanted to go swimming, we'd like jump off the boat and go swimming. And there were like kayaks we could go out. It was like really like a fun experience. And but I had never spent that much time close to water. Like I grew up near a lake. I live in New York. There's a lot of water around, but I never had the experience of like I wake up and I'm on water. I go to bed and I'm on water. And whenever I would sit on the boat looking at the water, I would see these ripples. I would see the reflection of light on the water. and think like, in 1,000 years, I could not code this, right? In 1,000,000 years, I could not write the algorithms to create what I'm seeing right now. And that's a really like intimidating feeling, and just feeling like, oh, maybe all of what we're doing with generative art is like to try to approach some beautiful thing that we would never be able to do. But then I thought, maybe if I could just express the feeling, right? What does it feel like to see light reflected on water, to feel this kind of like, this moment in time? And so a lot of these ripple sketches are kind of based on that feeling.
And then coming back to the show, you talked a bit about being inspired by Vera Molnar's curation, but I wondered if we could talk a bit more about how you have a background in printmaking, how you approached selecting the types of paper and then the contrast between the still images and the moving images, what thought you put into even like what kind of screens you wanted to show them on, all that stuff.
Sure. So there are 3 styles of printing in the show. There's G-clay printing, there's C-print on metallic paper or with kind of metallic elements, and UV printing. So we can start with the UV printing, which is this circular piece. And that's UV printed on the back of Plexi. So it's a form. I had experience previously. A collector asked for a large work, and we did UV printing, and it was the first time I had tried it. And it's quite a beautiful way to make, non-rectangular objects. So I feel really excited about this print. And then G-clay printing is something that I'm very familiar with because I print in my studio, and I have this practice of like making and printing and making and printing. And I think personally, I don't understand images until I hold them in my hand. And a lot of the circle work are G-clay prints, and also the blobs. And then the ripples are C-prints, and they're on Fuji metallic, which is a kind of paper that has metallic pigments in it. So actually some of the whites look more like silver, and it's just a different way. Those prints are amazing. They came to me they shipped them from London, so I could look at them and sign them and send them back, and they are like photographs. They were like proper photographs. They felt like I was holding like photographic paper in my hand. And I oftentimes have this way of describing the work is like, these are photographs of math. And it just felt so nice to be like holding it. It was like, oh, wow, like it actually is a real photograph. And then in terms of the moving work, they're presented here on 4 portrait screens, just as a kind of framing mechanism. I'm a really big fan of these are 9:16 aspect ratios. I tend to work in a lot of square or like alternative aspect ratios. We like the 9:16, and it feels a bit like they are because a lot of this still work is coming from moving elements. It's a way of seeing how the movement and the still works are in conversation with each other.
And then what about in terms of scale? Like, how do you decide what the scale is going to be? Because obviously on a screen, it depends on what screen people are using. Yeah,
I mean, in this, I would say it was really a lot of really great input from Unit, from Alice and Phoebe and the folks here in terms of, what will fit the space, right? And, I wasn't sure, and so we talked about it, and we came up with some size ideas, and mocked it up, and it started to look really good. So, of course. I mean, I print, but I print at a sort of small scale, so it's very exciting for me to like unroll these prints in my studio and see them quite large made me so happy.
I know one of the things when we spoke ahead of this talk, because education is so important to you, I said, is there anything in particular that you want to discuss? And you said the only one thing that I want is to be able to, if anyone wants to know about how you get into all of this and what sort of advice you would give to people. I think that, I thought that was really nice that was something you wanted to talk about.
So first thing is how to get into, so some question that comes up often is like, I'm interested in this work. How do I get into it? And the thing that I would say is, the best thing to know is that there are lots of tools around these projects. The community around the work that you're seeing here is really, really generous. There are open source tools. So for example, I mentioned openFrameworks, which is a tool I helped create, but also P5.js is a JavaScript framework. It's based on processing. But it's not just the tools. Those tools are, in fact, communities, that there are actually really great communities of people behind the tools that are making work, sharing work, publishing code, sharing ideas, answering questions, asking questions. And the one thing that I always ask students to do, if you're interested in this field or interested in these tools, is you maybe get out of your comfort zone and ask a question. Like jump on a forum, jump on a mailing list, take a workshop, and start. It's really intimidating to ask questions at first, but the people that I've found in this communities are so warm and non-judgmental, and especially with beginners, really friendly, really kind of, in a way, it's free software, but you pay with time. And the way you pay with time is in asking questions, answering questions, getting involved in community. And so I would say one great way to get started with this is just try different tools out, ask questions, become part of the community, because it will take weeks. Like you start asking questions, and like within weeks you'll be answering questions. Like it's really, I see it happen all the time. And then in terms of advice for students, I would say the most important words you can know are yes and no. That actually, like, it's really challenging when you're getting started, knowing what to say yes to, knowing what to say no to. And I think it's really important to understand those words and what those words feel like, and actually what saying no is a way of saying yes. Like when you say no, it's setting boundaries or conditions for how you want to work, and your no's lead to yeses. And I've found like that's one piece of advice that I've always given students. And then the second one is that I teach this class. So I was in Boston, 3 days ago, teaching this class called Recreating the Past. Every week I come in, I will give a lecture about John Whitney or Ken Knowlton or Lillian Schwartz or Vera Molnar, and the students recreate the work. And I always start the class with the same lecture. And the lecture is talking about like why is it important to recreate work from the past. And there's a book that I reference in the lecture called The Art of Computer Designing by a Japanese designer named Osamu Sato. It's a book from the 90s. It's about how to use the computer to make art. And I love this book. It's wild, it's super weird. And he's thanking people at the end of the book, and he said, I would like to thank my favorites, Futurism, avant-garde Bauhaus, whose brilliant typefaces in many ways have shaped my own mind. If the artists were alive now to work with computers, I'm certain they would discover new artistic possibilities. The work of past ages accumulates and is remade again. And I think that last sentence is super important. The work of past ages accumulates and is remade again. I think there's something really profound there, which is, for students in particular, the work of the past is there for you to recreate. It's both a gift and an obligation. It's a gift to know that you can have a conversation with these artists, that you can get to know them, that you can make work in dialogue with them, that you can recreate work and learn by seeing the world how they see it. But also it's kind of your job. Like it's your obligation, it's your job as a student to recreate the work, but recreate it with today's voice, with today's tools, with today's intentions. So that sentence is super important, I think. I think it's really amazing. Like it's really interesting to be able to create images from words in that way. I have found, especially not like image generation, but even experimenting with code itself. So having like tools like Copilot or just asking questions and having almost a kind of dialogue about code, I found it very helpful. Like a very eager intern, but somebody that I have to pay a lot of attention to. It's not like I can't trust, but like the intern's like, oh, I got it. And I'm like, are you sure? I have seen really beautiful work that artists have been making with prompting and generative AI. I do think the tools sort of they kind of lead to a sort of averaging in a way, or, they are getting better and better, like, don't get me wrong. But I do think there's almost a kind of an element of sometimes almost cliche in some of the works that I see, that it feels like really, gives me a lot of anxiety. And I think one thing I worry about is the idea that these tools were sort of trained on the internet before, 2022, and what's going to happen, like when we're producing so much material, like when these tools are trained on the output of these tools, what happens? I do think it's interesting and it's weird. And I think artists and designers should be there seeing what's possible and exploring and pushing it and challenging it. But I don't use it in my own work. I'm just happy to write code, you know, and things are going to change. And change can feel really scary, but it also can lead to like really crazy and interesting innovation. So yeah, I'm both apprehensive, but also excited, if that's a way of describing my feeling. For me, the most exciting discoveries have come from just serendipitously bumping into something or even seeing something on the street. Yeah, I have found one thing that I always recommend to students when I'm teaching is I come in every week. They're very annoyed by this, but the first thing that I do in class is I say, like, what have you seen in the last week? And it's like, at the beginning of the semester, like, nobody's seen anything and nobody has a good answer. And then by the end of the semester, everybody's like, oh, I went to this show, or like, they know I'm gonna ask the question. But the reason I ask the question is that I just think the inspiration comes from serendipity, and it comes from an engaged practice of listening. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly feedback helps. Like, it's nice to know that people see your work. The most important thing is that I listen to my own voice. The reason I'm sketching, the reason I'm posting is for me to better understand my work and myself and what I'm interested in, what I'm not interested in, and to kind of like have no preconceptions about the direction that I'm going. One thing that I found really interesting is the notion that sometimes I like something and people don't like it, or sometimes I don't like things and people really like it. To me, those are the most interesting moments, which are when are my ideas in and out of harmony with the world? And you start to understand like ideas that you want to fight for. I think if you're just optimizing for likes or just optimizing for, people saying like, that's great, that's not the right way to approach it. But the right way to approach it is to figure out like, what can I learn? What's a signal? To me, some of the most valuable feedback is when people tell me what they see. Like, to me, that feels really beautiful to see how other people see the work. And the things that I don't pay attention to are people telling me what to do. And I have this phrase that I repeat over and over again. It's probably annoying. I say, DJ does not take requests, which is like, I'm like, I want to listen to my own voice. And there's so many voices in your head telling you not to post something. As a creator, there's a lot of voices like telling you like, it's not good enough, it's stupid, it's simple, whatever. It's repetitive, it's been done before. There are probably 1,000 things that you could hear that could tell you not to do something. And so I don't want to let like strangers' voices in my head tell me what to do or how to approach it or what's better than what. But actually, I am trying to silence those voices and just trying to find like a very true and honest voice to the work.
I think we can all take something from that.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Zach. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.